International news now.
All right, before we get into the conflict between the U.S. and Iran, let me provide some basic information about Iran. So let's begin with geography and scale. Iran is about 630,000 square miles, making it the second largest country in the Middle East, behind Saudi Arabia. Now, size matters because it gives Iran influence across multiple borders in a crucial region. Iran sits at the crossroads between the Middle East, Central Asia, South Asia, making it strategically important. Now, one of Iran's most important geographic features is its strategic location near the Strait of Hormuz, and we're going to talk more about this at the end of lecture as well. This narrow body of water, the Strait of Hormuz, is one of the world's most critical choke points for global energy shipping. A significant portion of the world's oil supply, about 20%, passes through this very narrow strait, meaning Iran's proximity gives it outsized leverage in regional security and global energy markets. Even the possibility of a disruption in this area has international consequences. And so we're gonna, like I said, walk through this later in lecture. Another key aspect of Iran's strategic importance is its role as a key global energy producer. Iran possesses the world's fourth largest proven oil reserves, I looked it up, accounting for 9% of the global total oil reserves, behind Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Canada. I didn't know Canada. I mean, I knew it had a lot of oil, but they're way up there. Yeah. It also has the second largest, I didn't know this one, it has the second largest proven natural gas reserves, just behind Russia. Never mind. Just behind Russia. Iran was a founding member of OPEC, and at its peak in the mid-1970s, Iran exported over 5 million barrels of oil a day. That peak was in 1974. I was 8 years old. You were not born yet, maybe?
I was a year.
Yeah. Well, Iran was killing it that year in exporting oil, right? Now, Iran's oil exports have dropped significantly over the years because of Western sanctions and also some underinvestment, and it hit a low of about 500,000 barrels per day. So a huge drop during the first Trump administration when President Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal and then put on really severe sanctions, right? Now, currently, 90% of Iran's exports go to China, this underscores how China has helped Iran evade international sanctions on its oil export. China gets Iran's oil at a heavy discount, though, and so this increases Iran's economic vulnerability because they're selling it at such a lower price. Next, let's consider Iran's demography. Iran has a population of approximately 93 million people, making it one of the most populous countries in the Middle East. The population is predominantly Persian and majority Shia Muslim. This makes Iran the largest Shia Muslim majority country in the world. Now, since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran has been a theocratic republic. The highest authority in Iran is the supreme leader, currently Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He holds office for life and he sets major domestic and foreign policies for the country. He also appoints the head of the judiciary and commands the Revolutionary Guard. Now, there are popularly elected officials, the president and parliament, that manage daily governance. These elections are suspect in terms of their validity. They're often marked by a lot of fraud, but they do have these competitive elections. However, these bodies, the president and the parliament, are subject to approval in their decisions by the Clerical Guardian Council, which is also appointed by the supreme leader. So this is a very hierarchical, authoritarian state. Finally, regional relationships greatly impact Iran. In addition to its conflict with the United States, Iran has powerful regional rivals in Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states. Iran's regional allies are primarily armed militant groups that Iran itself finances and supports, including Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. It had one really key ally in a state, and that was Syria, but Syria and the Assad regime recently fell, and Syria no longer is under the influence of Iran. Iran also has a much stronger tie with Iraq now, ever since the Shia majority in Iraq has gained a foothold and control over that government.
And why did the Shia get a foothold in Iraq? I mean, that's linked to the war in the U.S. war in Iraq that displaced and toppled Saddam Hussein, that reset the distribution of power in the region and created a new government with closer ties with Iran.
Right.
So we're now going to move on briefly to describe the history of the long conflict between the United States and Iran, and we'll start this section with the clip from I-24 News. So let's roll that clip now.
In 1953, the United States helped orchestrate the overthrow of Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, reinstating the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had close ties with the West. Fast forward to 1967, the U.S. provided Iran with a nuclear reactor and enriched uranium. Iran would sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968, promising not to pursue military nuclear capabilities. Relations remained strong in the 1970s. U.S. President Richard Nixon visited Tehran, cementing security ties and establishing Iran and Saudi Arabia as the twin pillars of U.S. Middle East strategy. Everything changed in 1979. Iran's Islamic Revolution forced the Shah into exile, and Ayatollah Khomeini returned to lead the country. Iranian students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, holding 52 Americans hostage for 444 days. By 1980, the U.S. had severed diplomatic ties, seized Iranian assets, and imposed severe trade restrictions. In 1983, Hezbollah, backed by Iran, launched a bombing attack on the U.S. Embassy and Marine barracks in Lebanon, killing 300 people. Despite the hostility, the Reagan administration secretly sold arms to Tehran in the 80s, and in 1988, a U.S. Navy warship mistakenly shot down an Iranian civilian plane, killing 290 people. In 2002, President George W. Bush labeled Iran part of the axis of evil. Tensions escalated, with accusations that Iran was developing nuclear weapons in secret. Following the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, Iran-backed militias launched attacks on American forces. In 2011, the U.S. uncovered an Iranian plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to Washington. In 2013, President Hassan Rouhani was elected, promising better relations with the world. In 2015, Iran and 6 world powers, including the U.S., reached a nuclear deal aimed at curbing Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. However, in 2018, President Donald Trump pulled the U.S. out of the nuclear deal, reimposing harsh sanctions. Relations hit a new low in 2020 when the U.S. killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, leading to missile strikes from Iran on U.S. military bases in Iraq. In 2022, massive anti-regime protests erupted in Iran, leading to U.S. sanctions against officials involved in the crackdown. By 2023, the U.S. and Iran engaged in a prisoner swap, signaling a small thaw in relations. Yet, in October 2023, the conflict escalated once again, as Iran-backed Hamas launched a deadly attack on Israel, with Iran's allies in Hezbollah and Yemen's Houthi group joining in. Israel retaliated, and the U.S. intervened to help shoot down Iranian missiles targeting Israel. As tensions continue to mount, U.S. President Donald Trump has warned Iran that failure to reach a nuclear agreement could lead to military action, a threat Iran has responded to with defiance, warning of severe retaliation. The complex, tumultuous history between the U.S. and Iran is far from over. As the region remains volatile, the question remains, can diplomacy prevail, or is this rivalry doomed to persist for generations?
Okay,
All right,
so
here
let
we
me
go.
say a few things here. First of all, hostilities between the United States and Iran are deeply ingrained with long historical ties. And let's start with the coup d'etat in 1953, partly orchestrated by the CIA. Between 1951 and 1953, the United States and Great Britain played a decisive role in removing Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh from power after he nationalized Iran's oil industry. The covert action, known as Operation Ajax, shifted power to the monarch, the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He ruled Iran with U.S. support and increasingly authoritarian means until 1979. During that time, Iran was a crucial ally of the United States in the volatile Middle East with deep economic, military, and intelligence cooperation. The 1979 Iranian Revolution transformed the United States from Iran's closest ally into one of its primary adversaries. Militants and revolutionary groups moved to remove the Shah after decades of authoritarian rule, marked by political repression and corruption. Many Iranians viewed the Shah as a symbol of foreign interference, especially from the United States. For the United States, this watershed social revolution was viewed primarily through the prism of the Iran hostage crisis. After revolutionaries overthrew the US-backed Shah, Iranian militants seized the U.S. embassy in Tehran and held American diplomats hostage for over a year. The crisis humiliated the United States and reinforced revolutionary leaders' portrayal of America as a hostile imperial power. Together, the revolution and the hostage crisis severed diplomatic relations and entrenched mutual distrust. And they played a significant role in the downfall of President Carter as well.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah.
The political downfall of President Carter.
Right. Now, following the revolution and hostage crisis, the United States and Iran settled into a hostile relationship for decades. Iran and Iraq fought a destructive war between the two in the 1980s, with the United States supporting Iraq. Iran developed ties to terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah that threatened U.S. interests and U.S. allies in the 1980s and the 1990s. Later in the 2000s and 2010s, Iran added Houthi rebels to its network of armed proxy groups. In the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, President George W. Bush included Iran as part of the axis of evil, along with Iraq and North Korea. These states were marked by their sponsorship of terrorism. Later, President Bush accused Iran of developing nuclear weapons and initiated economic sanctions in response to Iran's nuclear weapons program. President Obama strengthened these sanctions in 2010. Relations improved for a brief period during the Obama administration when President Obama negotiated the Iran nuclear deal, which attempted to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons in exchange for sanctions relief on Iran. In 2018, President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from that agreement, arguing that it failed to curb Iran's regional behavior and had weak long-term limits on its nuclear program. Now, the withdrawal led to the virtual collapse of the deal and renewed sanctions on Iran and heightened tensions between the two countries. And finally, in June 2025, Israel launched major strikes against Iran's nuclear and military infrastructures, triggering a brief but intense war between Israel and Iran. Days later, the United States joined in directly into this conflict, striking Iran's nuclear facilities in an effort to severely degrade Iran's nuclear program. Iran responded with large-scale missile and drone attacks on Israel and later launched retaliatory missile strikes against U.S. Military bases in the region. And this sharply escalated regional tensions before they came to a ceasefire.
So now that we have some historical context on the long-running conflict with Iran, we're going to discuss the specific developments and issues underlying the current crisis. So this current conflict revolves around two main developments: political domestic instability within Iran and the push by the Trump administration for a new deal on Iran's nuclear weapons program. First, Iran is in the midst of its most significant political crisis in years, and the Trump administration has supported protesters who have called for the end of the regime. About a month ago, mass protests broke out across all of Iran, driven initially by economic grievances, but then expanding to demands for regime change. At the height of the mass demonstrations, President Trump posted, quote, "Iranian patriots, keep protesting. Take over your institutions, exclamation, exclamation, exclamation. Help is on its way." He also canceled meetings with Iranian officials and posted that those repressing protesters will, quote, "pay a very big price," unquote. President Trump also moved significant military assets, including the aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, to the Middle East to show resolve surrounding his threats to potentially use force. He followed that up by sending a second aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, from the Caribbean Sea to the Middle East. Now, the Iranian government violently put down the demonstration, killing thousands of protesters. The Trump administration, for now, has refrained from using force in response to this repression and has concentrated on negotiating a new deal over Iran's nuclear program. The United States has continued to build up military force in the region, and the use of force against Iran, if a deal cannot be reached, is still on the table. It's a possibility. Second, the United States wants to negotiate a new agreement surrounding Iran's nuclear weapons program. As we said earlier, President Trump withdrew from the original Iran nuclear deal during his first term, the JCPOA that you read about in the textbook. He argued at the time that the agreement was a flawed one that did not provide enough safeguards against Iran resuming its nuclear weapons program, building new nuclear weapons in the future, and it did not sufficiently address Iran's ballistic missiles and Iran's support for regional proxies that supported U.S. interests and U.S. allies in the region. So Trump...
They threatened it, not supported.
Yeah. Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah.
My bad.
Yeah.
So now he wants a new agreement, and we're back at the negotiating table. And so this is the context under which the United States and Iran held the first round of talks on a nuclear deal that were held in the Gulf state of Oman in early February 2026.
And just to the second round, it happened. The second set of talks happened today.
Again, we're filming on Tuesday.
Tuesday.
Right. So the first round were indirect talks in which American and Iranian officials met with Omani officials, but not each other. These were very preliminary talks aimed at testing intentions and setting a framework for future negotiations rather than reaching substantive agreements. Both sides described the talks cautiously, agreeing to continue dialogue amid heightened regional tensions. It should be noted that just a few days after this first round of talks, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu moved up his planned visit with President Trump, which shows that the Israeli government's concern about any potential deal between the U.S. and Iran. Netanyahu pressed for tougher positions going into the negotiations, urging limits not only on Iran's nuclear activities, but also on its ballistic missile program and regional proxies. President Trump has voiced similar positions, but during the meeting insisted that the talks should continue. Now, throughout this process, President Trump has kept the military option on the table, even as he negotiates with Iran on a nuclear deal. But he still says he prefers diplomacy over the use of force.
Right. All right. So now we are going to take a step back and examine why the Trump administration is considering using military force in its current dealings with Iran. Now, although there are a number of factors involved here, we're going to argue that the threat of military strikes against Iran is largely due to a series of political, economic, and military setbacks experienced by Iran that make it particularly vulnerable at this time. So let's begin with political weakness of the Iranian regime. We're going to start this discussion about the political weakness of Iran, Iran's government, with a clip from Bloomberg News. So let's roll that clip now.
Violence on the streets, threats from abroad. The Islamic Republic of Iran is being squeezed. The Iranian regime is running out of options, and the people are running out of patience.
The Islamic Republic is out of tools other than force.
Regimes that rely entirely on force, they can last for quite some time. But it really does change the nature of their relationship with the population that they govern. The more people you kill, the more resentment there is.
Some estimates put that death toll possibly in the tens of thousands.
The other thing that makes these protests different is that they had initially an economic trigger.
But it turned into something much broader. There's a real sense of hopelessness in Iran right now.
This time, people had simply had enough and they wanted the regime gone.
It's facing a US president, unlike any US president that it's had to face in its 47-year history.
President Trump has warned Iran to make a nuclear deal with the US or face military strikes.
They should want to make a deal. They know the consequences if they don't.
Iran says it has agreed with the U.S. to continue talks to de-escalate and avoid a military confrontation.
Talks are ongoing, but there's little doubt that the government has been weakened.
These protests will keep coming up and the regime will keep having to put them down by force. And at some point, you may see an end to the republic as we know it.
Okay, so let's talk about this in a little more detail. The first thing to note is that these recent protests that started right at the end of 2025, or very end of December of 2025, and went through about the first couple weeks or so of 2026 in January, they are considered by most observers as the most significant threat to Iran's regime since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Now, Iran has experienced several rounds of mass protests and dissent over the last, say, 15 years. There was the Green Movement in 2009 that emerged in response to an alleged electoral fraud that kept the sitting conservative president who ran for re-election in power. There were other protests in 2011 and 2012 in solidarity with mass protests across the Middle East that overthrew authoritarian regimes in Egypt and Tunisia during the Arab Spring. In 2019, there were protests over high fuel prices. And in 2022, there were mass demonstrations for greater rights for women that were sparked by the death of a young woman while she was in the custody of the morality police. That's what they call it. In all of these cases, the government used force and successfully put down the demonstrations. Now, compared with earlier waves of protest, the current protests have involved broader social groups from all sectors of society. The protests also unfolded on a larger, more nationwide scale in cities outside of Tehran, but even into smaller towns across the whole country. The recent protests were also marked by an unprecedented level of coercion as the government used extreme violence to crack down on dissent. Now, information is still coming in, and it's going to always be tentative and estimates because there's a lot of censorship, of course, in Iran. But the number of killed protesters, most like human rights groups say is well over 6,000. Some estimates place the number of dead protesters in the tens of thousands. Now, many thousands more have been arrested and are continuing to get arrested as this crisis keeps going. The authorities also shut down the internet in the country to prevent coordination between the protesters and to keep images of the thousands killed out of the international, media. It didn't work very well, but there would have been a lot more had they not did that censorship. Now, I will say the extreme repression cuts two ways, in my opinion. First, the regime is signaling its determination to remain in power through any means necessary, including mass repression of its own citizens. There has not been any signs of splits within the top leadership or within the security forces that are doing the repressing, right? And so when an authoritarian regime starts to be on the brink of downfall, usually there's splits within leadership, or security forces start to refuse to use force against citizens or somehow take a different side. But so far, the regime has held together. Now, at the same time, the extreme level of violence further undermines whatever legitimacy might be left for the regime, and it fuels greater resentment among a wider part of the population. Now, finally, it must, and this was brought up in the clip here, President Trump's military threats add additional pressure on the regime. Most notably, one unique aspect, and I saw this in a lot of the news stories I was reading here, of the current situation is that some opposition figures and even ordinary citizens in Iran are actually calling on the United States to attack their own country because they see this as perhaps the only way to topple a repressive government that they now completely reject and see as their primary threat to their well-being. So
Iran does not only face a crisis of political weakness and illegitimacy, it's also in the middle of a severe economic crisis. And the following clip from the Canadian broadcast company highlights the problems facing the Iranian economy. So let's roll that clip now.
Iran's economy is facing one of its sharpest declines in years.
The country's currency, the rial, has crashed to a record low.
Years of sanctions, isolation, and mismanagement in Iran have crippled its currency. 50 years ago, you could buy a US dollar for about 70 Iranian rials. 50 days ago, it cost you about 900,000 rials for one US dollar. 50 minutes ago, last I checked, you needed somewhere between 1.3 and 1.5 million rials for that same dollar.
That's huge. And so that has impact. Then obviously, pent up frustration, anger for many, many decades. It brought a lot of people onto the streets that did not protest in past rounds of unrest.
Average annual inflation has hovered stubbornly at around 40%. If you have savings in Iran, they have evaporated in real time. The country's biggest commodities, oil and gas, are restricted on world markets, sanctioned by the US. There are widespread business and government shutdowns for almost every conceivable reason. Water shortages, gas shortages, power outages, too much air pollution, too hot, too cold. By any reasonable standard, these are all signs of an exceptionally vulnerable economy. Again, something which the US may see as exploitable right now.
All right, so the economic crisis fueled the protests and thus is a major source of Iran's political weakness. However, the economic pressures also limit the options available to the regime in terms of both its domestic policy and foreign policy responses. Iran's economic crisis has caused turmoil in three major areas. First, the value of the country's currency, the rial, has collapsed. As the clip powerfully demonstrates, the Iranian rial is literally losing value on a daily basis. It now takes well over 1.5 million rials to equal one US dollar. In 2022, it was 430,000 rials to $1. 10 years ago, in 2016, it was 34,000 rials to $1. This kind of currency collapse wipes out life savings for anyone who holds the currency.
So I've got a currency devaluation story.
Okay.
So
let me guess, it's about Russia.
It is, because when I was in Russia in 1991, I was doing dissertation research. You were probably like 5.
So, I was in high school.
Okay, yeah. I was doing dissertation research in 1991. The economy was just collapsing. And so, all of what they're describing here as 1.5 million rials to one is not the official exchange rate. Of course, it's the on the street exchange rate. And so on the street, so in 1991, the ruble in Russia started to collapse and prices went skyrocketing, but I held dollars. And so I quickly learned that if I exchanged them with some people I knew instead of at the bank, I could get a lot more. So I was fine, but it was a shock because I was staying at Moscow State University dormitory, not a pleasant place. Right? And the price of bread, I get this loaf of bread in the basement, bakery thing, And it was already really high, right? Because inflation had, and the ruble had already dropped. And I was spending 30 rubles for that loaf of bread, but 30 rubles was like 2 cents for me, so it was fine. But then by the end, I was there from September to December of 1991. By the end, it cost 1,500 rubles to buy that same loaf of bread.
So the price increased by a factor of 50.
Yeah. And then the ruble just collapsed. And so I stayed with this family while I was doing research, and the grandmother of the family got a big pension, a huge lump sum from her husband when he died, and she was going to buy this apartment with it. But then this happened, and it wiped it all out. And instead, she used that same hundreds and hundreds of thousands of rubles to buy her granddaughter a pair of shoes. Bednaya grandmother was what they always, Bednaya's poor grandmother. Yeah.
But think about that, from a house to a pair of shoes. That's what hyperinflation does.
And that's what's happening here. Yeah. That's what's happening to anybody who didn't get what they call hard currency, like dollars. And that's a lot. Most people, they can't get access to this.
When did you leave Russia in 1991? In December?
Right
before the 25th? What day did you leave?
Like the 20th. Oh. Yeah.
The Soviet Union collapsed
on the
Gorbachev
25th.
On the 25th of December, 5 days before.
Yeah.
All right, so
I had to get home for Christmas, because, priorities.
So let's get back to Iran. This currency collapse has fueled high inflation, which has remained above 40% annually, with food prices rising even faster. Staples such as bread, rice, cooking oil, and meat have become increasingly unaffordable for many families, while wages have failed to keep pace. Much of the population, particularly the urban middle class and the poor, are just trying to survive day to day. It doesn't stop there. Alongside monetary instability, there's a crisis of public provision of necessities. There are rolling electricity blackouts and fuel rationing that disrupt industry, transportation, and daily life. Iran is also experiencing its worst drought in decades, leaving reservoirs at historic lows and threatening water supplies in major cities like Tehran. All of these economic calamities, of course, will further and accelerate political discontent and potentially trigger more widespread protests eventually. These problems also make Iran even more vulnerable to pressure from the United States. U.S. sanctions have long been one of the key factors that increase pressure on the Iranian economy. Now that the economy is in a free fall, these sanctions are even more painful and creates then an opportunity for President Trump to exploit this weakness as leverage, holding out the carrot of cutting the sanctions and facilitating economic recovery.
So lastly, Iran and its proxies, such as Hamas and Hezbollah, have suffered a series of military defeats and setbacks, and this has greatly reduced the ability of Iran to project military power in the region and to deter foreign powers like the United States. And so we're going to talk about how the third pillar here is military weakness, and we're going to show another clip from that CBC news program on Iran's military weakness. So let's roll that clip now.
When we think about the balance of power in the Middle East, it's important to remember Israel's multi-year war in Gaza was not simply a war on Hamas. It was also a war on Hezbollah in Lebanon and on Houthis in Yemen, all critical proxies through which Iran has historically projected power. But crippling Iran's agents stretched Iran thin as well. So thin, it was unable to prop up its other key regional ally in Syria. The toppling of Bashar al-Assad by rebels in 2024, a loss of one of Iran's most important partners. Then, there were the direct attacks on Iran itself.
Iranian officials now say more than 900 people were killed during Israel's 12-day bombing campaign.
Israel says at least 3 of Iran's top military commanders were killed, and its largest uranium enrichment site was damaged.
The U.S. military carried out massive precision strikes on the 3 key nuclear facilities in the Iranian regime.
The Iranian regime is unprecedentedly weak abroad and at home in this post-October 7th period in the Middle East. So its proxy network across the Middle East is degraded as a result of U.S. military or Israeli military actions. At home, the regime's nuclear program and missile program is rolled back. And then domestically, this is a regime who cannot provide a stable economy, cannot provide consistent electricity, can't even provide enough water for the Iranian people.
So, to repeat the point, there is undeniably a window of opportunity here, a fairly singular chance to destabilize a regime that routinely threatens death to America.
All right, so let me expand on Iran's current military weakness a bit. As the clip showed, Iran suffered multiple military setbacks over the last couple of years. First, Iran's regional proxy network of armed militant groups has been significantly weakened. Let me give you a few more details about that. Israel's military had campaigns that have badly degraded Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon. In Gaza, Israel's war against Hamas has decimated that militant group's ranks, both the group's leadership and the group's foot soldiers. This has greatly reduced the operational capacity of Hamas and its ability to threaten Israel. Similarly, in late 2024, Israel dismantled much of Hezbollah's leadership and command infrastructure through a complex operation that included airstrikes, intelligence operations, and cyber actions. The centerpiece of the campaign was a covert operation in September of 2024 in which thousands of Hezbollah pagers and walkie-talkies blew up simultaneously across Lebanon. The supply chain attack wounded thousands of Hezbollah fighters and killed dozens and crippled Hezbollah's communications. And this represented the most severe internal security breach that militant group had experienced in decades. Perhaps the most damaging of all was for Iran's proxy network and alliance system was the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria in December 2024. This severed Iran's most important regional ally and its logistical corridor to Hezbollah. Syria had functioned as the backbone of Iran's axis of resistance, and its loss sharply curtailed Iran's ability to move weapons or personnel and to project influence across the region. Okay, so the proxy network is very damaged. Second, Iran's domestic defenses have been exposed and degraded. During the June 2025 Israel and Iran war that lasted 12 days, Israel struck nuclear facilities, ballistic missile infrastructure, senior military personnel, all inside Iran. The United States escalated it further and directly attacked key nuclear sites at Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan, inflicting severe damage and setting back Iran's nuclear program. These strikes not only destroyed key elements of Iran's nuclear weapons infrastructure, but it also demonstrated that Iran's most sensitive military assets were vulnerable to U.S. and Israeli attack. And finally, Israeli and U.S. strikes exposed fundamental weaknesses in Iran's self-defenses, in its air defenses in particular. Israeli operations rapidly suppressed Iranian radar and surface-to-air missile systems, and Israel achieved effective control over Iranian airspace. Iran's Air Force largely stayed grounded during this conflict, and that allowed the United States and Israel to strike deep into Iran with minimal resistance. These failures revealed serious deficiencies in the ability of Iran to defend itself. And so, in short, Iran is at a historic low point in terms of its military power. And you add that to the political turmoil and the economic problems here. It still has some capabilities that's not to be doubted, right, to respond to threats. However, the combination of weaker proxies, damaged nuclear and ballistic weapons facilities, and weak air defenses make Iran very vulnerable. As a result, the U.S. can more effectively threaten to use military force to gain leverage in negotiations on Iran's nuclear weapons program. The Trump administration may also be more willing to follow through on those threats, thinking Iran just doesn't have the capability to retaliate effectively.
So now we're going to turn to the negotiations between the United States and Iran on a new nuclear deal. We're first going to watch a clip from the PBS NewsHour that provides an overview of these talks. So let's go ahead and run that clip.
Nick, let's start with the U.S. and Iran. What do we know about how those talks went today?
Well, the Trump administration has provided no readout at the moment. But in the lead up to these talks, we heard from Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the top negotiator Steve Witkoff that Iran must not make any nuclear fuel domestically, must restrict the range of its ballistic missiles, must end its support for proxy groups, and account for highly enriched uranium that has been missing since last summer's strikes. Today, the U.S. held indirect talks. You see Witkoff there with the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, meeting Oman's foreign minister, who then met with Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, who said the talks focused on nuclear weapons and were a, quote, good start.
We were able to exchange our viewpoints, to express our concerns and our interests for a possible deal between the two sides on our nuclear question.
Araghchi said there would be a new round of talks, no confirmation of that from the U.S. side, which for the first time included the top U.S. military commander from the Middle East, a reminder, Amna, of President Trump's threats against Iran and that military buildup still in the region.
So what do the experts tell you all of that means for the possibility of an actual deal?
Well, that's the question I put to Kareem Sajapur of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is very skeptical of any deal over Iran's nuclear program, missile program, or support for proxies, including Hezbollah and Hamas.
The Iranian regime still seems so intent on defying the United States, and they fear that if they give in to pressure, it's going to project weakness and invite even more pressure. Up until now, Iran has shown no flexibility on moderating its ballistic missile program or its regional proxies. And so the Iranian goal is to limit this conversation only to nuclear, and even then to drag on the conversation.
Drag on the conversation, Amna, so it doesn't get bombed by the United States.
So let me offer a few points here. The main takeaway from the preliminary negotiations is that the United States and Iran have starting positions that are very far apart. The U.S. has one primary goal, that is ensuring that Iran cannot acquire nuclear weapons. The Trump administration has taken a maximalist position of zero enrichment, under which Iran would be prohibited from enriching uranium at any level on its own territory. President Trump and his negotiators have even described zero enrichment as a red line, asserting that allowing even low-level enrichment leaves Iran with a latent nuclear weapons option. This is also the position pushed by Israel. The United States also wants to expand the negotiations to include restrictions on Iran's ballistic missile program and its regional activities through proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah. Iran, by contrast, insists its nuclear program is peaceful and argues that as a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, it has the right to enrich uranium for civilian purposes. Iranian negotiators thus reject demands for zero enrichment. However, Iran has signaled conditional flexibility. It has indicated willingness to dilute highly enriched uranium and accept verification measures. Iran also wants the negotiations to center only on its nuclear program without including any discussions surrounding its ballistic missiles or its relationships with regional armed militant groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Of course, Iran's main goal in these negotiations is to offer substantial sanctions relief to help obtain substantial sanctions
well, they're
relief.
Offering that, so yeah, you can give that to us.
Substantial sanctions relief to help its ailing economy. Thus, it will seek binding commitments to lift economic sanctions in exchange for concessions on its nuclear program. This sounds familiar. Given Iran's current political, economic, and military weaknesses, President Trump will likely use military threats as leverage to bridge these gaps between the two positions.
So let me just give you, I've been reading today the recent, about the recent talks, right? Today's talks in Geneva. And the zero enrichment position is going to be the key thing that hinges on a deal or not.
Yeah.
And as late as Friday of last week, President Trump said we cannot allow any enrichment in Iran. So he staked out a position that is zero enrichment.
I'm
still
smiling because this sounds familiar,
Right,
right? And Jerry,
right.
we talked about this in the context of Greenland, but anyway, go
Right,
ahead.
and
Yeah.
so he said zero enrichment, and of course the Iranian negotiators are rejecting zero enrichment. And so on Sunday, right before this second round of talks, there was an interview with the deputy foreign minister of Iran, and he said that the zero enrichment option is off the table, that it's no longer on the bargaining table, and that they're moving on, and that he kind of implicitly was saying, like, yeah, the United States is backing away from that. He's being overly optimistic, I would say. But that is the key hinge here. Now, there's going to be other stuff too, especially ballistic missiles, regional proxies. But that still is, I would say, secondary, right? The key thing is are they going to get a deal on the nuclear weapons program, and that Iran will be willing to accept and give some sort of concession that comes close enough to a zero enrichment that the United States or something. That's where all of this leverage stuff comes in, because that's what he's going to try to do, is to get his best deal. And then I would say perhaps if it gets close enough, then he'll call it zero, right? Maybe, something like that.
Yeah.
Because there are ways to, I saw another story that said that Iran might temporarily suspend all enrichment, but not give up its right to enrich, which would be another way to bridge that gap. But they're going to those are two mutually exclusive positions: zero enrichment and the nuclear non-proliferation treaties' right to enrich uranium for civilian purposes. They can't coexist.
Do you want to talk about domestic politics in here, or you want to wait to talk about domestic politics?
Well, let's wait here. I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of the strategy of using military force, but also the risks. And then I think we should get into, like you said, domestic politics. So the strategy is pretty clear, and it's been mentioned a lot in the clips that we've seen, right? It's that Iran is particularly vulnerable right now, and so just the threat of using military force could be enough to get a lot of crucial concessions from Iran. And so I think that is what the optimists, if you will, are hoping, is that this is just threats and not going to be followed through. Because the other big point I want to make is that even though the threat of a military strike on Iran might get a deal that would include some real significant concessions from Iran that are enforceable and better even, or stronger perhaps, than the previous Iran nuclear deal, an actual military strike on Iran has a ton of very risky outcomes, right? And so I just wanted to kind of...
Can I say, before you get into risks, so I want to acknowledge these risks, but I also want to say, right, the credibility of these threats, though, is compounded by the weakness of Iran, in a sense, and this is where I was going to hint at in the domestic politics story, is there's a real potential. So yes, there's tons of risks. Rob's going to talk about the risks in a second. There's also a greater probability, given the weakness of the Iranian regime, that the successful military strikes could translate into severe and significant political consequences, emboldening the protesters even further. And so this is, I mean, for me, it's going to be tricky and interesting to watch here, because yes, the U.S. has an interest in avoiding conflict, but there's also lots of elements of opportunity where you could generate a lot of long-term political leverage by using sticks here, right? And I think, and if we're talking about the relationship between the U.S. and Israel, that's one of the core lessons that Israel has learned over the last 2 years, is when it was willing to use military force, then it reordered the region.
Yeah.
Right? And there is,
well, that's
I'm sure
why
that
we
there
are where we're at.
Yeah, and
right?
I'm sure there are advisors telling President Trump the same thing, that this is an opportunity that might not come again.
The thing about this, and this is why it's important to think about these risks, is precisely what you're talking about in terms of the domestic politics is the domestic politics within Iran.
Yeah.
But the uncertainty surrounding what would happen if you destabilize that regime is the big risk, right? And so I'm going to break this out into two categories. One is the regime doesn't collapse, right? But holds even in the use of military strikes. Maybe the military strikes are very strategic and selective and things like that, and it doesn't just collapse. Even in that situation, a desperate Iranian regime that now is under attack militarily by the United States and who perhaps even Israel too, could take retaliatory action that would then escalate into a war. And so there's two things that I want to point out. It's on your slide here. The first one is this Strait of Hormuz. There could be, they could use that geographic strategic location to disrupt global oil trade by closing the Strait of Hormuz. And in fact, today, they temporarily closed the Strait of Hormuz and executed some military exercises with live ammo. Right, and so to demonstrate, again, to signal.
A costly signal.
Yeah, a sunk signal, right, to that we can do this and we will do this and we're practicing, right? And if that happened, then depending on how long they would close it and all sorts of other considerations, but it could then spike oil prices, which could have a real damaging effect on a lot of economies around the world, but even the United States economy, which right now has relatively low oil prices and gas prices, but could creep up, and then that would be, return the affordability issue domestically in the United States to a new height, right? Now, closing the Strait of Hormuz also hurts Iran itself, right? And so there is a trade-off there for Iran, but it might be worth it in the short term. And so that's the first big risk is that. The second one is that it could go a step further, and if it's under attack from the United States, it could use its ballistic missiles to attack the two aircraft carriers and other assets, military personnel at military bases around the regions. It could strike any of those things. It has enough missiles that have the long enough range to hit all of those American assets, right? And the supreme leader even kind of hinted at this, right? In reaction, in reaction to the United States sending the second aircraft carrier, he said, well, the only thing more dangerous than that very dangerous piece of equipment was the weapon that will take that ship to the bottom of the sea. And so they're like, we can do those things. And so the regime could attack U.S. forces. The biggest danger of that is the escalation here. It could be a regional war, right? Now, then the second set of risks here is regime change. Regime change is very risky in Iran in the sense that there's two potential outcomes of that are most likely. There's a third one, of course, that it could go through a transition and become a democracy. That is very, very unlikely, and so I'm not really going to talk about it because the historical examples and everything else from places like Syria, Libya, Iraq, you can name, numerous examples. It typically doesn't go that way, right? So instead, if you remove the regime somehow with military force, it's already under great strain, it's either probably going to be replaced by the military. And the military is the one who exercises their repression. And so that would mean that, especially for Iranian citizens, it's not going to get better under military rule. It could get even worse. The military probably won't be like the Venezuelan regime that was left behind after they removed Maduro. It won't probably cooperate with the United States. And so you just have another authoritarian regime that's very repressive to its people and not cooperative with the United States, and definitely won't be eager to strike a deal about nuclear weapons or ballistic missiles or anything like that.
Before you talk about collapse, can I talk about an alternative, right? So one of the hopes when governments like when governments like the United States talk about engineering regime change in other states, right? The implication is, well, we get regime change and we'll get a more friendly government in power, but we'll have some similarity in foreign policy interests and we can cooperate. And so here, the hope might be that we don't get the Iranian military, but we get moderates that come to power.
Right.
Well, the challenge with that is that domestically, if those moderates come initially to power, but then opposition to the moderates, the subsequent opposition to the moderates says, well, you're in bed with the United States, you undermine the legitimacy of the moderate regime, and so you compound their long-term challenge associated with building legitimacy from the public. And so if the U.S. is picking winners and losers in states like this, it can actually undermine the groups that it wants to cut deals with in the international regime. And so this temporary bolstering of what might look like a cooperative coalition with Iran could backfire in the long run.
Exactly. And then the worst case scenario is that there's regime collapse, and in the wake of that is chaos. There's, it could be, there would likely be mass migration out of Iran. There could be civil war among competing groups. I mean, there could be a complete loss of social order and violence just on the streets among individuals. That would be a catastrophe.
Yeah,
and remember how big and populous Iran is.
Yeah.
I mean, this would be a huge catastrophe.
Well, and we have recent historical lessons for this. Iraq, after 2005, and Syria after 2011. And it's important to recognize that those conflicts and the consequences of them, they spread globally.
They did, right. Yeah, I mean, it changed the politics in Europe.
Yep.
And so that, and of course, the Trump administration wants to avoid that. The Trump administration, I'm pretty certain, is not entertaining any sort of American military intervention that would mean boots on the ground in Iran. But if it just does some bombing and the regime collapses and this happens, then what's the United States going to do? And how are they going to resist pressures to do something?
Yeah.
And then you think about what happened in Syria and Iraq. You've got the problem of international terrorist groups. ISIS emerged out of those things too. And so those are the risks, and they're really huge risks. And the problem is that threats of force and use of force could achieve some real goals for the United States. A nuclear deal that's stronger and more enforceable and everything else, or even with some selective use of force, some sort of reduction of Iran's ability to lash out at its neighbors and the like. But how do you know that those bombing campaigns aren't going to produce option D, right? The collapse of the regime and all the terrible things that would happen there. And so the problem is managing an outcome you have no idea what that outcome might be. It could be, a range of options. A lot of them are really bad. So,
this makes a couple things on this, and then I know we need to get going.
Right.
So I was thinking about conversations that I had with our students in the run-up to the last exam, talking about grand strategy and how do we understand the differences between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0.
Right.
You can think about this case, the Iranian case. This is a test that's going to be revealing, in some senses, where Trump 2.0 is.
Right.
Is it a bold, aggressive stance in Iran that tries to remake the region, or do we see a limited deal, which is basically a resumption of or some form of the JCPOA?
Right.
That would look more like Trump 1.0.
Yes.
A more aggressive deal, potentially using military force, looks more like what we saw in Venezuela. The other thing that I thought about this, and this goes back to
a lot bigger than in Venezuela,
yeah,
though.
Yes,
right?
a lot bigger.
In a
but
lot
in terms
more
of,
volatile region.
Yes, but at least in terms of the goal of regime change.
Sure.
The other thing that I thought about, both linking grand strategy in our prior conversations about Russia, is thinking about the H.W. Bush administration in the summers in 90 and 91, and they're really concerned about toppling the Soviet Union. And so there's
the chaos that could have came out of that.
And there's a restraint there, right? Understanding and seeing a huge strategic opportunity to end the Cold War, to take advantage of the Soviet weakness, but also very cognizant of the risks that would follow if there was a complete implosion of the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons, and they didn't want to do that. And there's some comparison here, right? Because this is a big...
And I would say that George H.W. Bush doesn't get enough credit for managing that, because in the end, they got a lot of their goals without any of the worst case scenario fallout, right? They got a united Germany in NATO. I mean, they got a ton of things.
A temporarily democratic Russia, and a lot of the subsequent challenges for U.S. interests stem from the mismanagement of the U.S. relationship with Russia in the 1990s. Less about how it managed the collapse of the Soviet Union in 89 to 91.
Yeah.
So. Anyway, this is, I mean, lots of ways to
important. This is an inflection point, just like, you know, all the other ones we've talked about. So
maybe bigger in the grand strategic sense than Venezuela.
I tell you, I'm still, you know, I can't. This one is the hardest one to predict. I think, in terms of like, what will the Trump administration do? Is it actually going to launch strikes against Iran? Right now, I'd say I think he's pretty reluctant to do that, but we'll see. It depends on how the negotiations over the nuclear stuff goes.
I honestly have no idea. Like,
of course,
I mean, it's
who would, but that's part of the strategy, is to be unpredictable.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
To cultivate and think about this again, private information, and in the discussion of the bargaining model, one of the incentives to cultivate uncertainty is to try to get a better deal.
Right.
And that's what's going on here, right? This is a broader renegotiation of the political order in the Middle East. The U.S. is trying to devise military and economic constraints on Iran that limit its ability to project force and threaten U.S. interests and its allies in the region, principally Israel and Saudi Arabia.
Right.
So.
All right, I think we should close there.
Sure. We'll see you in a couple weeks.
Yeah. See you.